I paid someone $200,000 to be my friend, but he ended up destroying everything I thought I knew about myself, about friendship, about what it means to be human in a world where everything has a price tag. My name is Marcus Chen, and I'm 34 years old. I'm also worth approximately $47 million, give or take a few million depending on how the market's feeling that day. But money, as I learned in the most brutal way possible, can't buy you the one thing you need most when you're drowning in success but starving for connection. It started innocently enough, the way most disasters do. I was sitting in my penthouse office on the 42nd floor of a Manhattan high-rise, staring out at a city full of 8 million people, feeling more alone than if I'd been stranded on a desert island. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had everything money could buy. The apartment that cost more than most people make in a lifetime, the cars that turned heads on every street corner, the watches that could fund a small country's education budget. But I hadn't had a real conversation with another human being in months. My assistant, Patricia, knocked on the door with the kind of practiced politeness that comes with a six-figure salary. "Mr. Chen, your lunch meeting with the Yamamoto group has been moved to 3 o'clock. Also, your mother called again. She wants to know if you're bringing anyone to your cousin's wedding next month." The question hung in the air like smoke from a cigarette you wish you'd never lit. Bringing someone to a wedding. Such a simple concept for most people. For me, it was a reminder of everything I lacked. "Tell her I'll probably be working," I said, though we both knew it was a lie. I always used work as an excuse, but the truth was I had no one to bring. No one to call when something amazing happened. No one to text when I saw something funny on the street. No one who cared about my day beyond what it could do for their own bottom line. That evening, I found myself doing what I'd been doing for weeks, scrolling through social media, watching other people live the lives I wanted, college friends posting pictures from group vacations I was never invited on anymore, business acquaintances sharing moments with people who laughed at their jokes, not because they were paying them, but because they actually found them funny. I'd become a ghost in my own life, present in body but absent in every way that mattered. The idea came to me at 2:30 in the morning, born from desperation and too much expensive whiskey. If everything else in my life could be purchased, why not friendship? Not in the crude way you might imagine, not an escort or companion service, but something more sophisticated, more honest, a professional relationship where both parties understood the terms from the beginning. I'd pay someone a substantial sum to be my friend, to text me good morning, to grab dinner, to be available for conversations that weren't about quarterly earnings or market projections. The more I thought about it, the more sense it made. At least it would be transparent. No hidden agendas, no wondering if someone liked me for my money or for who I actually was underneath all the success. We'd both know exactly what the relationship was built on. I spent the next morning crafting what had to be the strangest job posting in the history of employment. "Seeking a professional friend," I titled it. High net worth individual looking for genuine companionship on a contractual basis. Must be intelligent, articulate, and available for regular social interaction. Excellent compensation for the right candidate. Serious inquiries only. I posted it on several high-end job boards, the kind used by wealthy families looking for private chefs or personal assistants. Within hours, my inbox was flooded with responses. Most were what you'd expect, people who clearly saw dollar signs and nothing else, but one stood out. His name was David Reeves, and his response was unlike the others. He didn't immediately ask about money or benefits. Instead, he wrote a thoughtful 3-paragraph message about loneliness in the modern world, about how technology had connected us to everyone and no one simultaneously. He mentioned that he'd recently finished his PhD in psychology and was taking a break from academia to figure out his next steps. He said he'd been drawn to my posting not just for the financial opportunity, but because he was genuinely interested in the human experiment I was proposing. "I've spent years studying human connection," he wrote, "and I'm curious about what happens when we remove the pretense and uncertainty that usually surrounds friendship. Maybe we could learn something valuable about what it really means to care about another person." I read his message 5 times before responding. There was something about his tone. Not desperate like the others, not calculating, but genuinely thoughtful. He included a photo, and I saw a man about my age with kind eyes, and a smile that looked real even in a digital image. Dark hair, medium build, the kind of person who'd blend into a crowd but might surprise you with the depth of his thoughts once you got him talking. We arranged to meet at a small cafe in Soho, the kind of place where conversations happened over coffee that cost more than some people's hourly wage. I arrived first, claiming a corner table where we could talk without being overheard. When David walked in, I recognized him immediately, but what struck me was how he moved through the space, confident but not arrogant, observant without being obvious about it. He was wearing jeans and a simple button-down shirt, nothing expensive, but he wore them like they were exactly what he'd chosen to wear, not what he'd settled for. "Marcus," he said, extending his hand as he approached the table. His handshake was firm without being aggressive, and he made eye contact in a way that suggested he was actually seeing me, not calculating my net worth. "David, thank you for coming." I gestured to the empty chair across from me. "I have to ask, when you saw my posting, what was your first reaction?" He smiled, and I caught a glimpse of what might have been relief in his expression. "Honestly, I thought it was either the most honest thing I'd ever read, or the most depressing, maybe both." He settled into his chair and looked directly at me. But then I realized that most friendships have some kind of transaction at their core anyway. Usually, we just don't acknowledge it. It was exactly the kind of response I'd hoped for, intelligent, thoughtful, without judgment. We talked for 2 hours that first day, covering everything from philosophy to our favorite movies to our respective childhoods. I learned that David had grown up in Oregon, the son of 2 teachers who'd instilled in him a love of learning, but not much in the way of financial security. He'd worked his way through graduate school, living on ramen and determination, driven by questions about human behavior that kept him awake at night. "What made you leave academia?" I asked as we ordered our 3rd round of coffee. "The same thing that probably made you post that ad," he said. I realized I was studying human connection from the outside, never actually experiencing it myself. I spent so much time analyzing relationships that I forgot to have them. By the end of our conversation, I knew I wanted to hire him, but more than that, I realized I genuinely liked him. He was intelligent without being condescending, curious without being invasive. When he laughed at something I said, it didn't feel performed or calculated. It felt real. "So," I said as we prepared to leave, "assuming we move forward, what would this arrangement look like to you?" David was quiet for a moment, and I could see him choosing his words carefully. "I think we need to be clear about boundaries and expectations, but beyond that, I'd want it to feel as natural as possible. Text conversations, dinners, maybe we catch a movie or go to a basketball game, the kinds of things friends actually do. And in terms of compensation, whatever you think is fair," he said. "I'm more interested in seeing if this can actually work than I am in negotiating the perfect salary." I named a figure that made his eyes widen slightly, $200,000 for 1 year of friendship. It was more than most people made in several years, but for me, it was a rounding error. For David, I could see it represented something closer to freedom. "That's generous," he said finally. "Consider it an investment in an experiment," I replied. "One that I hope benefits both of us." We shook hands in the cafe, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, anticipation for a relationship that might actually go somewhere. Even if it was built on a contract rather than organic connection, it felt more honest than most of the interactions in my life. The first few weeks were admittedly awkward. David and I both seemed hyper-aware of the artificial nature of our arrangement. Our conversations felt slightly stilted, like we were actors who hadn't quite learned their lines yet. He'd text me in the morning with, "How's your day starting?" and I'd respond with updates about meetings or deals, but it all felt a bit like we were going through the motions. The breakthrough came during our 3rd week together. I'd had a particularly brutal day. A deal I'd been working on for months had fallen through, costing my company several $1,000,000. Normally, I would have gone home, poured myself 3 fingers of whiskey, and stewed in my own frustration until I fell asleep watching financial news. Instead, I found myself texting David. "Worst day I've had in years." Feel like punching a wall. His response came back immediately. "Want to actually punch something instead?" "I know a place." 20 minutes later, I was following him down a set of stairs into what looked like the basement of an old warehouse. The sign above the door read Brooklyn Boxing, and inside, the air smelled like sweat and determination. David talked to the guy at the front desk, paid for 2 pairs of gloves and an hour with the heavy bags. "You ever boxed before?" he asked as he helped me wrap my hands. "Does hitting my pillow when I was 12 count?" Close enough. For the next hour, I beat the hell out of a leather bag while David coached me on form and technique. Every frustration from the day, every accumulated stress from months of living inside my own head came pouring out through my fists. By the time we finished, my hands were sore, my shirt was soaked with sweat, and I felt better than I had in months. "How did you know," I asked, as we sat on a bench sharing a bottle of water. "Know what?" "That this was what I needed." David shrugged. "When I'm angry or frustrated, I need to move." "Figured you might be the same way. Also," he grinned, "you looked like you were ready to murder someone, and I thought it was better to channel that energy somewhere constructive." It was the first time our interaction felt completely natural, unmarked by the strangeness of our arrangement. I wasn't paying David to take me boxing. He'd chosen to do it because he thought it would help. For the first time since we'd started this experiment, I forgot about the money entirely. From that point forward, our friendship began to feel more genuine. David had a way of reading my moods and suggesting exactly the right activity. When I was stressed about a board meeting, he'd show up with tickets to a comedy show. When I was excited about a new investment opportunity, he'd suggest we celebrate with dinner at some hole-in-the-wall restaurant he'd discovered. He seemed to understand that despite my wealth, what I needed most were experiences that felt authentic. But it wasn't just David adapting to my needs. I found myself paying attention to his moods and preferences too. I learned that he was a massive science fiction fan, so I started buying first edition books by his favorite authors, not as payment, but as gifts between friends. I discovered he'd been wanting to visit the Metropolitan Museum's new exhibition, but couldn't afford the membership, so I bought us both annual passes, and we started spending Saturday mornings wandering through galleries. The strangest part was how quickly I stopped thinking about our arrangement as a business transaction. David was simply present in my life, in the way I'd always wanted a friend to be. He remembered details about my work, asked follow-up questions about conversations we'd had weeks earlier, and seemed genuinely invested in my well-being. When my mother had a minor health scare, he was the first person I called. When I closed my biggest deal of the year, he was the one I wanted to celebrate with. 3 months into our arrangement, something shifted. We were having dinner at a small Italian place in Little Italy, arguing good-naturedly about whether artificial intelligence would eventually make human creativity obsolete, when David said something that stopped me cold. "You know, Marcus, I don't think I've ever had a friend I could talk to about this stuff. Most people either don't care about these kinds of philosophical questions, or they pretend to care because they think it's what I want to hear." The comment struck me as profound in its simplicity. Here was David, someone I was paying to be my friend, telling me that our friendship was fulfilling something genuine for him too. It made me wonder if maybe we'd stumbled onto something real, despite the artificial circumstances of how we'd met. That night, I lay awake thinking about the nature of our relationship. Was it still a paid arrangement if both parties were getting something authentic out of it? David was collecting his salary every month, but he was also sharing parts of himself that money couldn't buy. I was paying for his time, but I was also receiving genuine care and attention that felt nothing like a service. I decided to test my theory. The next week, I didn't transfer David's monthly payment, not because I was trying to cheat him, but because I wanted to see what would happen. Would he disappear? Would he demand his money immediately? Would the mask come off and reveal that this had all been an elaborate performance? None of those things happened. David continued texting me, continued making plans, continued being the friend he had been for months. When 5 days passed without his usual payment notification, he sent me a single text. "Everything okay? You seemed distracted yesterday." He wasn't asking about money. He was asking about me. I transferred double his usual amount that afternoon, along with a message. "Sorry for the delay. Everything's fine. Want to grab dinner tonight?" His response was immediate. "Always. There's a new Korean place I've been wanting to try." It was in that moment that I realized something profound had happened. We'd started as a business transaction, but somewhere along the way, we'd become actual friends. The money was still changing hands, but it had become incidental to the relationship itself. David wasn't performing friendship for me. He was actually my friend, regardless of the paycheck. By month 6, David had become an integral part of my life in ways I hadn't anticipated. He was my +1 for business events, and his natural charm and intelligence made him a hit with clients and colleagues. He helped me pick out gifts for my mother's birthday and gave me advice about how to handle a difficult situation with my business partner. When I got food poisoning from a questionable sushi place, he showed up at my apartment with soup and spent the evening making sure I stayed hydrated. The boundaries between our professional arrangement and genuine friendship had become so blurred that I sometimes forgot how we'd started. David felt like family in a way that my actual family never had. He knew my coffee order, my favorite takeout places, my irrational fear of elevator music. He'd learned to read my moods well enough to know when I needed to talk and when I needed to be left alone. But with that closeness came complications I hadn't anticipated. David had opinions about my life that went beyond the scope of our original arrangement. He thought I worked too much, spent too little time taking care of myself, and needed to address my complicated relationship with my parents. Unlike the yes men who surrounded me in business, David wasn't afraid to disagree with me or call me out when he thought I was making a mistake. "You can't just throw money at every problem," he said one evening as we walked through Central Park. I'd just finished telling him about my plan to buy my way out of a lawsuit rather than deal with the underlying issue. Why not? It's efficient. Because some problems need to be solved, not avoided, and because you're never going to grow as a person if you keep using your wealth as a shield. It was exactly the kind of direct feedback I needed, but rarely received. David wasn't worried about offending me or jeopardizing his employment. He spoke to me like an equal, like someone whose well-being he genuinely cared about. It was uncomfortable and valuable in equal measure. The first real test of our friendship came in month 7. David's father had a heart attack and he needed to fly to Oregon immediately. He called me from the airport, his voice shaky with worry and exhaustion. "I have to go," he said. "I don't know how long I'll be gone. My mom can't handle this alone, and my dad..." "God, Marcus, what if he doesn't make it?" "Go," I said immediately. "Don't worry about anything here. Just take care of your family. But our arrangement..." "Forget the arrangement. Your father is in the hospital. Nothing else matters right now." I continued paying him his full salary while he was in Oregon, even though he was obviously unavailable for any friend duties. It wasn't about the contract anymore. It was about supporting someone I cared about during a crisis. I also used my connections to help arrange for a cardiac specialist to consult on his father's case, something David never asked for, but accepted with gratitude that felt more meaningful than any paycheck. He was gone for 3 weeks, and I realized how much his absence affected my daily life. The city felt lonelier without our regular dinners and conversations. I caught myself starting to text him updates about my day before remembering that he had more important things to worry about than my latest business deal or random thoughts about the weather. When he returned, his father was stable and recovering, but David looked exhausted from weeks of hospital vigils and family stress. We met for coffee, and I could see the weight of the experience in his eyes. "Thank you," he said before we'd even ordered, "for everything, the salary, the specialist, just being understanding about me disappearing. You don't have to thank me. That's what friends do." He was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him processing something. "Marcus, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you still think of this as a paid arrangement?" The question hung between us like a challenge. I realized I'd been avoiding thinking about it directly, but David was forcing me to confront the reality of what our relationship had become. "No," I said finally. "I haven't for months." "Then why do you keep paying me?" It was a fair question, and one I struggled to answer. Because that's how we started. Because I don't want you to feel trapped or obligated. Because... I paused, trying to find the right words. Because I'm afraid that if I stop paying you, you'll disappear. David leaned back in his chair, studying my face with the intensity I'd learned to associate with his most serious thoughts. You really believe that? After everything we've been through together, you think I'm only here for the money? I don't know, I admitted. I've never had a friendship that didn't start organically. I don't know what happens when we remove the financial component. What if we found out? The suggestion terrified and thrilled me in equal measure. What are you proposing? End the payments. Keep being friends. See what happens. It sounded so simple, but for me, it felt like stepping off a cliff. The money had been my security blanket, my guarantee that David would stay in my life even when I was difficult or boring or too wrapped up in my own problems. Without it, I'd be just another person hoping someone would choose to spend time with him. What if you decide you don't actually like me when you're not being paid to tolerate me? I asked. David smiled, and for the first time since he'd returned from Oregon, he looked like himself again. Marcus, I've been your friend for 7 months. The only thing that's going to change is that you'll stop feeling guilty about enjoying our friendship. We shook hands across the coffee table, officially ending our business arrangement and beginning what I hoped would be a genuine friendship. David insisted on paying for our coffee that day, a small gesture that felt enormously significant. The transition was smoother than I'd expected. Without the weight of a financial transaction hanging over our interactions, I found myself relaxing into the friendship in ways I hadn't anticipated. I stopped second-guessing David's motivations or wondering if he was just humoring me. When he laughed at my jokes or sought out my opinion on something important, I could trust that his responses were genuine. But ending the payments also revealed aspects of our relationship that had been obscured by the business arrangement. David had his own life, his own friends, his own priorities that didn't revolve around me. He started cancelling our standing dinner plans occasionally to spend time with other people or pursue his own interests. At first, this felt like rejection, but gradually I recognized it as the natural rhythm of a healthy friendship. I also discovered that friendship, when it's real, involves reciprocity in ways that employment doesn't. David started calling me when he needed someone to talk to about his own problems. He asked for my advice about career decisions and relationship issues. He expected me to remember important details about his life and to be available when he needed support. It was what I'd always wanted, to matter to someone the way they mattered to me. But it was also more demanding than I'd anticipated. The first real crisis in our post-contract friendship came about 2 months after we'd ended the financial arrangement. David had been offered a position at a prestigious research institute in California, a dream job that represented everything he'd worked toward academically. It was also 3,000 miles away from New York, which meant 3,000 miles away from me. He told me about the offer over dinner at our usual Italian place, and I could see the excitement in his eyes, even as he tried to downplay it. It's a great opportunity, he said carefully, but it would mean leaving New York. My first instinct was to offer him money to stay. I could match whatever salary they were offering, could provide him with his own research budget, could give him everything he wanted right here in the city. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the memory of his comment about me using money to solve every problem, or maybe it was the recognition that real friendship sometimes means wanting what's best for someone even when it's not what's best for you. You have to take it, I said, and I meant it. Really. David, this is what you've been working toward your entire career. I can't be the reason you don't pursue your dreams. He was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him processing the implications. I'd miss this, he said finally. I'd miss you. I'd miss you too. But that doesn't change the fact that you need to go. The conversation continued late into the night as we walked through the city streets. David shared his fears about starting over in a new place, his excitement about the research opportunities, his uncertainty about leaving behind the life he'd built in New York. I found myself playing the role of supportive friend, encouraging him to take the risk even as the prospect of losing him felt like a physical weight in my chest. Can I ask you something? David said as we stood outside his apartment building. Anything. If we'd never ended the contract, would you be trying to convince me to stay? The question cut right to the heart of everything. Probably, I admitted. I would have made it about what I needed instead of what was best for you. And now I want you to be happy, even if that happiness doesn't include me. David smiled, but there was sadness in it. You know, that might be the most generous thing anyone's ever said to me. He accepted the job 2 weeks later. We spent his remaining month in New York doing all the things we talked about but never gotten around to. Visiting the Statue of Liberty, seeing a Broadway show, taking a cooking class that ended with us covered in flour and laughing until our sides hurt. It felt like we were trying to pack years of friendship into a few weeks, creating enough memories to sustain us through whatever came next. The night before David left, we had dinner at the same small cafe where we'd first met almost a year earlier. The conversation was different this time. Deeper, more reflective, tinged with the bittersweet awareness that something significant was ending. "Do you think it worked?" David asked as we shared a dessert neither of us really wanted. "What do you mean?" "The experiment. Paying someone to be your friend. Do you think we proved it's possible?" I considered the question carefully. I think we proved something more interesting than that. We proved that genuine connection can emerge from the strangest circumstances. We started as a business transaction and ended up as real friends. That's not nothing. "What are you going to do now?" It was a question I'd been avoiding, but David's departure had forced me to confront it. "I don't know. I can't exactly put up another job posting for a replacement friend. That would be insulting to what we built together." "Exactly." David reached across the table and put his hand on mine. "Marcus, you don't need to pay anyone to be your friend anymore. You know how to be a friend now. You know what it feels like and what it requires. The training wheels are off." His words were meant to be encouraging, but they terrified me. Being David's friend had felt natural because he'd made it easy, guiding me through the unspoken rules and expectations of genuine friendship. Without him, I'd be on my own, trying to form connections with people who didn't know about my social inadequacies or my tendency to solve problems with money instead of effort. David flew to California on a Tuesday morning. I offered to drive him to the airport, but he said goodbyes were easier when they were quick and private. We hugged outside his apartment building, and I watched him load his entire life into a taxi and disappear around the corner. For the first time in almost a year, I was truly alone again. The weeks that followed were brutal. I realized how much of my daily routine had been built around David's presence in my life. The restaurants we'd discovered together felt empty when I ate there alone. The movies we'd planned to see together remained unwatched. Even my apartment felt different, larger and more isolated than before. But something unexpected happened in the midst of that loneliness. Instead of retreating back into my work and isolation, I found myself reaching out to other people. I accepted invitations I would have previously declined. I initiated conversations with colleagues that went beyond business. I even called my mother regularly, something that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. It was as if David had taught me a language I didn't realize I'd been missing, the language of human connection. I still made mistakes, still sometimes defaulted to offering money when what people actually wanted was time or attention. But I was learning, slowly and sometimes awkwardly, how to be the kind of person others wanted to spend time with. David and I maintained regular contact through text and video calls. He shared photos of his new lab, stories about his research, updates about the life he was building 3,000 miles away. I told him about my tentative attempts at forming new friendships, my struggles with being more open and vulnerable, my small victories in learning to connect with others. "I'm proud of you," he said during one of our calls, about 3 months after he'd moved. "It sounds like you're doing exactly what you need to do." "I have a good teacher," I replied, "even if he's currently on the wrong coast." 6 months after David left, I met Sarah. She was a journalist working on a story about my industry, and we were supposed to have a brief interview about market trends. Instead, we ended up talking for 3 hours about everything from economic inequality to our shared love of old science fiction movies. When she mentioned that she was having trouble finding a good Thai restaurant in her neighborhood, I found myself offering to show her my favorite place instead of simply giving her the address. Our first dinner wasn't a date exactly, but it wasn't purely professional either. It was something in the middle, the kind of organic social interaction I'd been learning to navigate since David's departure. Sarah was smart and funny and genuinely interested in ideas rather than just gathering quotes for her article. By the end of the evening, I realized I'd been myself in a way that felt both natural and terrifying. "Would you like to do this again sometime?" I asked as we stood outside the restaurant. "I'd like that," she said, and her smile suggested she meant it. Dating Sarah was different from being friends with David, but the skills were surprisingly transferable. I'd learned how to listen without immediately trying to fix everything, how to share my own thoughts and feelings without constantly second-guessing whether they were interesting enough, how to be present with another person without constantly checking my phone or thinking about work. We'd been seeing each other for about 2 months when Sarah asked the question I'd been dreading. "Marcus, can I ask you something? You seem like someone who's very comfortable with people, but sometimes I get the sense that you haven't always been that way. Am I wrong?" I could have deflected or given a vague answer about being shy in my younger years. Instead, I told her the truth, about the loneliness that had driven me to post that strange job listing, about David and our year-long friendship experiment, about how paying someone to be my friend had taught me what friendship actually meant. Sarah listened without judgment, asking occasional clarifying questions, but mostly just letting me tell the story. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "That's either the saddest thing I've ever heard or the most hopeful," she said finally. "Which do you think it is?" "Both. But mostly hopeful. It takes courage to admit that you don't know how to do something most people take for granted, and it takes even more courage to do something about it." Her response was exactly what I'd hoped for, but hadn't dared to expect. She didn't see my paid friendship with David as a sign that I was fundamentally broken or incapable of genuine connection. She saw it as evidence that I was willing to learn and grow, even when that growth required uncomfortable admissions and unconventional methods. A year after David left New York, he came back for a visit. I picked him up from the airport, and the first thing that struck me was how different he looked. California had been good to him. He was tanned and relaxed in a way I'd never seen before, clearly thriving in his new environment. "You look happy," I said as we navigated through airport traffic. "I am. The work is incredible, and I've met some amazing people, but I've missed this place. I've missed you." We spent his weekend visit catching up and revisiting our old haunts. I introduced him to Sarah, who'd insisted on cooking dinner for all three of us despite my offers to take them to whatever restaurant they preferred. Watching them interact was surreal. Two of the most important people in my life meeting for the first time, each representing a different chapter of my journey toward understanding what it meant to be truly connected to another person. "I like her," David said after Sarah had gone home. We were sitting on my balcony, sharing a bottle of wine and watching the city lights twinkle below us. "I was hoping you would." "How did you meet?" I told him about the interview that had turned into dinner, about how I'd applied the lessons he taught me about being open and present with another person. David listened with the same attentiveness he'd always shown, but there was something different in his expression, a kind of parental pride that made me realize how much I'd grown since we'd first met. "You know what this means, don't you?" he said when I finished the story. "What?" "The experiment was a complete success. You paid me to teach you how to be a friend, and now you're out there making genuine connections with people who have no idea about your unorthodox training methods. You graduated. It was a perspective I hadn't considered, but David was right. Our paid friendship hadn't been a replacement for genuine connection. It had been a masterclass in human relationships, taught by someone who understood both the theory and practice of authentic intimacy. I'd learned not just what friendship looked like from the outside, but what it felt like from the inside. How to be vulnerable without being overwhelming. How to be supportive without being controlling. How to be present without being possessive. "Do you ever regret it?" I asked. "Taking my money to be my friend?" David was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. "I used to worry that it somehow invalidated what we built together. But I don't think it does. We both got what we needed from the arrangement, and we were honest about what it was from the beginning. The money gave us permission to get to know each other without the usual social pressures and expectations. In some ways, it made our connection more genuine, not less. How do you think about it? Most friendships are built on a foundation of shared interests or circumstances or mutual benefit. We skipped all that and went straight to the question of whether we actually enjoyed each other's company. The financial arrangement removed the pretense and let us focus on whether we had genuine compatibility. It was a characteristically insightful observation from David, and it helped me see our story in a new light. We hadn't bought and sold friendship. We'd created the conditions for friendship to emerge organically, despite the artificial nature of our initial meeting. Besides, David added with a grin, that $200,000 paid off my student loans and gave me the financial freedom to take this research position. In a weird way, your loneliness ended up launching my career. We both laughed, recognizing the strange interconnectedness of how our lives had unfolded. My need for connection had led to his professional success, which had led to my growth as a person, which had led to new relationships that enriched both our lives in ways we couldn't have predicted. On David's last night in New York, we returned to the small cafe where we'd first met. The same corner table was available, and we sat across from each other just as we had almost 2 years earlier. But everything else had changed. I was no longer the isolated, desperate person who'd posted a job listing for a friend. David was no longer the uncertain graduate student looking for direction and financial stability. We'd both grown into versions of ourselves that our earlier selves might not have recognized. "What's next for you?" David asked as we shared coffee and reminisced about our strangest adventures together. "I don't know. Keep learning, I guess. Keep practicing what you taught me about being a real person instead of just a successful one." "And Sarah?" "We'll see. I'm trying to let things develop naturally instead of trying to control the outcome." "That's very mature of you." "I had a good teacher." David smiled. "For the record, you taught me things too, about generosity, about loyalty, about what it means to care about someone without expecting anything in return. When you continued paying my salary while I was in Oregon with my dad, when you encouraged me to take the job in California even though it meant losing your best friend, when you used your connections to help with his medical care without being asked, those weren't the actions of someone who was just paying for a service. Those were the actions of someone who had learned to love another person genuinely. The word hung between us, unspoken until that moment, but present in everything we'd shared. Love. Not romantic love, but the deep, abiding affection that exists between people who have seen each other at their worst and chosen to stay anyway. I'd paid David to be my friend, but somewhere along the way, we'd learned to love each other in the way that real friends do, unconditionally, unselfishly, with a commitment that transcends convenience or circumstance. "I do love you, you know," I said, surprising myself with the admission. Not in a way that makes things complicated, but in the way you love family, you actually choose. "I love you too, Marcus, and I'm grateful every day that you were brave enough to post that ridiculous job listing." We hugged goodbye outside the cafe, and this time it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like an evolution. David would return to California and continue building his new life. I would stay in New York and continue learning how to be the kind of person others wanted in their lives. But the foundation we'd built together, the understanding of what friendship could be when it was honest and generous and real, would remain with both of us wherever we went. 3 years have passed since David first responded to my job posting. He's now leading his own research team in California, studying the neurological basis of human attachment with a focus on how artificial social interactions affect our capacity for genuine connection. His work has been published in major journals, and he's been invited to speak at conferences around the world. I joke that our experiment has become the foundation of his entire career, but there's truth in the humor. Our unconventional friendship taught him things about human connection that couldn't be learned in any classroom or laboratory. As for me, I'm still in New York, still running my company, still worth more money than I know what to do with. But my life looks completely different now. Sarah and I have been together for over a year, and we've talked seriously about marriage. I've developed genuine friendships with several colleagues and neighbors, relationships that began with tentative invitations to coffee and grew into the kind of bonds I'd never thought possible. I even have a standing weekly dinner with my mother, conversations that go far beyond the superficial check-ins we used to exchange. Most importantly, I've learned to be alone without being lonely. The desperate isolation that drove me to hire a friend has been replaced by a comfortable solitude punctuated by meaningful connections with people who matter to me. I still value my privacy and independence, but they no longer feel like prison walls keeping me separated from the rest of humanity. David and I talk regularly, usually through video calls that stretch on for hours as we catch up on our respective lives. He's dating someone now too, a fellow researcher named Miguel, who shares his passion for understanding the brain and his tendency to overthink everything. David showed me pictures from their recent hiking trip, and I could see in his face the same contentment I found in my own relationships. "Do you ever tell people how we met?" I asked him during our most recent call. "Sometimes, when it feels relevant. Most people think it's either the most romantic story they've ever heard or the most dystopian, depending on their perspective on modern friendship. Which is it?" "Neither. It's just human. We were both lonely, and we found a way to connect despite the artificial circumstances. In the end, all friendship is a kind of mutual agreement to care about each other's well-being. We just formalized it with a contract before we knew we meant it." Last month, I received an unexpected email from someone named Jennifer Walsh. The subject line read, "Professional Friendship Services," and for a moment, I thought it might be spam. But when I opened the message, I found a thoughtful inquiry from a woman who'd somehow heard about my arrangement with David. She was recently divorced, new to a city where she knew no one, struggling with the same kind of isolation that had once consumed my life. She wanted to know if I'd be willing to share details about how I'd structured my paid friendship, whether I thought it was something that could work for others. I spent a long time crafting my response. I told her about David, about how our experiment had worked and why, about the risks and rewards of trying to purchase something as intangible as human connection. But mostly, I encouraged her to think carefully about what she was really looking for. Did she want someone to perform friendship for her, or did she want to learn how to be a friend herself? "The money isn't what made it work," I wrote. "The money was just what got us in the same room long enough to discover that we actually liked each other. If you're looking for genuine connection, you have to be prepared to give as much as you receive. You have to be willing to be vulnerable, to be wrong, to let someone see you as you actually are rather than as you think you should be. You can't pay someone to love you, but you can pay them to stick around long enough for love to develop naturally." I never heard back from Jennifer, and I hope that means she found what she was looking for through more conventional means. But her email got me thinking about the larger implications of what David and I had done together. In a world where loneliness has become epidemic, where technology promises connection but often delivers isolation, where the pace of modern life makes it difficult to form the deep, sustained relationships our ancestors took for granted, perhaps our experiment wasn't as unusual as it initially seemed. Maybe there are others out there who need what I needed, not just companionship, but a safe space to learn how to be truly intimate with another human being. Maybe the artificial structure of a paid relationship could serve as training wheels for people who, like me, never learned the subtle skills of friendship and connection. Maybe what feels like the commodification of human relationship is actually a return to the kind of intentional, structured bonds that existed in earlier societies through formal mentorship, apprenticeships, and community traditions. Or maybe David and I were just two lonely people who got lucky enough to find each other at exactly the right moment, under circumstances strange enough to strip away our usual defenses and pretenses. Maybe what worked for us wouldn't work for anyone else, and our story is notable only for its singularity rather than its replicability. I don't know the answer to those questions, and I'm not sure it matters. What I know is that I paid someone $200,000 to be my friend, and in return, I received something far more valuable than I'd bargained for. I received an education in what it means to be human in relationship with other humans. I received the gift of genuine connection, first with David and then with others who came into my life after I'd learned how to let them in. Most importantly, I received proof that it's never too late to learn how to love and be loved, even if the learning process looks nothing like what you expected. David often jokes that I hired him to be my friend, but ended up becoming his instead. The truth is more complex than that. We hired each other to be lonely together, and we ended up discovering that loneliness shared becomes something else entirely, a bridge rather than a wall, a beginning rather than an end. 6 months ago, I did something I never thought I'd do. I posted another job listing, but this time it wasn't for myself. It was for a non-profit organization I'd started, dedicated to addressing loneliness and social isolation among successful professionals who, despite their achievements, struggle with the same kind of profound disconnection I once experienced. The organization, which I named the David Foundation with my friend's permission, pairs people who are struggling with loneliness with trained companions who understand that sometimes the most artificial relationships can lead to the most authentic connections. We're careful to distinguish what we do from therapy or counseling. Our companions aren't trained to treat mental illness or provide clinical interventions. Instead, they're trained to be exactly what David was for me. A bridge between isolation and genuine human connection. The program is still small, serving maybe 20 clients at any given time, but the results have been remarkable. People who once felt invisible in crowds of thousands are learning to see and be seen by others. Clients who started the program convinced they were fundamentally unlovable are discovering that the capacity for connection was always there. It just needed the right conditions to emerge. David serves on our advisory board, contributing insights from both his personal experience and his professional research. He's helped us develop training protocols that teach companions how to create the kind of safe, structured environment that allows authentic relationships to develop. He's also helped us identify warning signs and establish boundaries that protect both clients and companions from exploitation or unhealthy dependency. The key, David explained to our first class of companions, is remembering that you're not trying to be someone's permanent solution to loneliness. You're trying to teach them how to connect with others so they won't need you anymore. The most successful relationships in this program are the ones that end because the client has learned to form organic connections with people in their regular life. It's a delicate balance, providing enough support and structure to help people learn the skills of connection while avoiding the creation of artificial dependencies that prevent genuine growth. But when it works, it's transformative in ways that go far beyond the individual relationships involved. One of our early clients, a tech entrepreneur named Alex, who'd built a multi-million-dollar company but hadn't had a real conversation with another person in years, recently sent me a photo from his wedding. His companion had helped him learn to be vulnerable enough to date, present enough to form deeper connections, and generous enough to maintain relationships that weren't directly related to his professional success. The companion's job had ended 2 years earlier when Alex no longer needed the structured support, but the skills he'd learned had created ripple effects that changed every aspect of his life. I know this sounds crazy, Alex wrote in the note that accompanied the photo, but hiring someone to teach me how to be a friend was the smartest business decision I ever made. It's also the most human decision I ever made. Stories like Alex's remind me why David and I were willing to risk judgment and misunderstanding to pursue our unconventional friendship. In a world that often treats human connection as a luxury rather than a necessity, sometimes the most radical act is admitting that you don't know how to love and be loved, and then doing something about it. The foundation has also attracted attention from researchers studying loneliness and social connection. Universities have reached out asking for data on our success rates and methodologies. Mental health professionals have inquired about incorporating our approach into their own practices. There's even been interest from international organizations looking to adapt our model for different cultural contexts. But the aspect of our work that means the most to me isn't the research potential or the scalability prospects. It's the individual moments when I see someone discover, often for the first time, what it feels like to be truly seen and accepted by another person. It's watching clients learn that they don't have to perform or achieve or purchase their way into connection, that they're worthy of love and friendship exactly as they are. Last week, I received a letter from a woman named Maria, who'd been one of our earliest clients. She's a successful surgeon who'd spent so many years focused on her medical training and career that she'd never learned to form close friendships. Her companion, a former social worker named Thomas, had spent 6 months helping her navigate the basic social interactions that most people take for granted. How to make small talk, how to show interest in others, how to be vulnerable without overwhelming people with too much personal information. Dr. Chen, Maria wrote, I wanted you to know that yesterday I was asked to be the maid of honor in my colleague's wedding. A year ago, I wouldn't have even been invited to the wedding, let alone asked to play such an important role. But more than that, I realized that when she asked me, I wasn't surprised. I've become the kind of person people want to celebrate their happiest moments with, and that feels like the most incredible gift. Reading Maria's letter, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this point. I'd started as someone so lonely I was willing to pay a stranger to pretend to care about me. Now I run an organization that helps other people discover their own capacity for genuine connection. I'd gone from someone who used money as a substitute for human relationships to someone who used resources to create conditions where authentic relationships could flourish. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd become successful at fostering human connection by acknowledging that sometimes money can play a role in creating the conditions for genuine relationships, but only when it's used as a tool rather than a replacement for the hard work of learning to be vulnerable, present, and generous with others. David visited New York again last month for a conference on social neuroscience. We spent an evening walking through the city, visiting places that had been significant in our friendship's development. The boxing gym, where I'd learned to channel my frustration productively. The museum, where we'd spent countless Saturday mornings discussing art and philosophy. The bench in Central Park, where we'd had some of our deepest conversations about what it meant to be human in an increasingly disconnected world. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't responded to your job posting? David asked as we sat on that same bench, watching joggers and dog walkers navigate the paths around us. Every day, I admitted. I think I would have eventually found some other way to address the loneliness, but I'm not sure it would have been as healthy or transformative. I might have just paid someone to hang out with me without doing the deeper work of learning how to actually be a friend. Or you might have given up entirely and decided that connection wasn't worth the effort. It was a sobering thought. How many people were struggling with the same isolation I'd experienced, but didn't have the resources or courage to do something as unconventional as hiring a friend? How many were suffering in silence, convinced that their loneliness was evidence of some fundamental flaw rather than a skill that could be learned like any other? That's why the foundation matters so much, I continued. Not everyone has $200,000 to spend on an experiment in friendship, but everyone deserves access to the kind of support that can help them connect with others. David nodded, and I could see him processing the implications of what we'd built together, both the personal relationship that had transformed both our lives and the larger organization that was now helping others discover their own capacity for connection. You know what I think the most important thing we learned was? David said as we prepared to leave the park. What's that? That loneliness isn't a character flaw or a sign of weakness. It's information. It's your brain telling you that you need connection the same way hunger tells you that you need food. The problem is that we've built a society that makes authentic connection increasingly difficult to find, so people end up feeling like there's something wrong with them rather than something wrong with the system. It was a perspective that had shaped everything about how we approach the Foundation's work. Instead of treating loneliness as a problem to be solved, we treated it as a signal that someone needed help developing the skills and creating the conditions for genuine relationship Instead of pathologizing the desire for connection, we normalized it as a fundamental human need that deserved to be addressed with the same seriousness as physical or financial health. As we walked back toward the street, David asked me a question that had been on his mind for months. Marcus, do you think what we did was ethical? Taking money for friendship? It was a question we'd discussed before, but it felt more urgent now that we were helping others navigate similar arrangements. I think it was ethical because we were honest about what it was from the beginning, I said. We both knew the terms, we both benefited, and we were both free to end it if it wasn't working. The problems come when people aren't clear about boundaries or expectations, or when someone tries to use money to force connection rather than create conditions where it can develop naturally. And you think our clients understand that distinction? I think they're learning it the same way we did, through experience. The ones who try to buy connection without being willing to give it usually don't stay in the program very long. The ones who use the structured support to learn genuine relationship skills are the ones who graduate to forming organic connections with people in their regular lives. David seemed satisfied with my answer, but I could tell he was still wrestling with the ethical implications of what we were doing. It was one of the things I respected most about him. His commitment to thinking through the moral complexities of even our most well-intentioned actions. For what it's worth, I added, I think the most unethical thing would be to keep this knowledge to ourselves. We learned something important about how connection works, about how people can be taught the skills of friendship and intimacy. If we can share that knowledge in a way that helps others, don't we have an obligation to do so? By the time David's plane left for California the next morning, I felt renewed in my commitment to the Foundation's work. Our conversation had reminded me why we'd started the organization in the first place, not to replicate our specific friendship, but to share the principles and practices that had made our connection possible. 6 months later, I received a call from a producer at a major television network. Someone had leaked the story of my paid friendship with David, and they wanted to create a documentary about our relationship and the Foundation's work. My first instinct was to decline. The last thing I wanted was to become a public spectacle or to exploit what David and I had shared for entertainment value. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that sharing our story publicly might be exactly what was needed. How many people were struggling with loneliness but didn't know that help was available? How many were suffering in silence because they thought their need for connection was shameful or unusual? How many could benefit from seeing that it was possible to learn the skills of friendship and intimacy even later in life? I called David to get his thoughts on the documentary proposal. His initial reaction was similar to mine. Concern about privacy, about commercializing something that felt sacred, about the potential for our story to be sensationalized or misunderstood. But, he said, after we talked through all the potential downsides, maybe the world needs to hear this story. Maybe there are people out there who need to know that it's okay to not know how to connect with others and that it's possible to learn. We agreed to participate in the documentary, but only if we had editorial control over how our story was told. We wanted to make sure that the focus remained on the broader themes of loneliness, connection, and the possibility of learning relationship skills rather than the sensational aspects of paying someone to be a friend. The documentary team spent 3 months interviewing us, following me around as I worked with Foundation clients, filming David in his California lab as he conducted research on social attachment. They spoke with Maria and Alex and several other former clients who were willing to share their stories. They interviewed companions who worked with the Foundation, mental health professionals who consulted with us, and researchers who are studying our model. The resulting film, titled The Friendship Experiment, premiered at the Sundance Film Festival 6 months later. I was terrified to watch it, afraid that our story would be reduced to a quirky human interest piece, or, worse, portrayed as evidence of how disconnected and transactional modern life had become. Instead, I found myself watching a thoughtful exploration of loneliness in contemporary society, the skills required for authentic connection, and the courage it takes to admit that you don't know how to do something as fundamental as friendship. The film treated David and me as flawed but sympathetic characters who had found an unconventional solution to a universal problem. The response to the documentary was overwhelming. Within days of its release, the Foundation's website was receiving thousands of visitors. Our email inbox filled with messages from people around the world sharing their own stories of loneliness and asking for help. Mental health professionals reached out wanting to learn more about our model. Other cities inquired about starting their own versions of the Foundation. But the message that meant the most to me came from a teenager named Jake in Ohio. He'd watched the documentary with his parents and wanted me to know that seeing our story had helped him realize that his struggles with making friends weren't a sign that something was wrong with him, but rather evidence that friendship was a skill he could learn like any other. I always thought people were just born knowing how to be friends, Jake wrote. But watching your movie made me realize that maybe I just need practice and maybe some help learning the rules. My parents are going to help me find someone to talk to about it. And I wanted to thank you for showing me that it's okay to admit that you don't know how to do something, even something that seems like everyone else finds easy. Reading Jake's message, I was reminded of why David and I had been willing to risk judgment and misunderstanding to share our story. Connection is a fundamental human need, but the skills required for authentic relationship aren't automatically distributed at birth. Some people learn them naturally through family, community, or social circumstances. Others need more structured support and guidance. There's nothing shameful about needing help learning how to connect with others. What's shameful is a society that treats loneliness as an individual failing rather than a systemic problem that deserves thoughtful, compassionate solutions. The documentary's success led to speaking engagements around the country. I found myself giving talks at conferences, universities, and corporate events about the nature of loneliness and the possibility of learning connection skills. The talks were always followed by long lines of people wanting to share their own stories of isolation and their struggles to find authentic relationships in an increasingly disconnected world. During one particularly memorable event at a tech conference in San Francisco, a young programmer approached me after my presentation. She couldn't have been more than 25, already successful enough to afford a luxury apartment and expensive clothes, but her eyes had the same desperate loneliness I recognized from my own mirror years earlier. "Mr. Chen," she said, "everything you described sounds exactly like my life. I have everything I thought I wanted, but I don't have anyone to share it with. I don't know how to talk to people about anything other than work, and I'm starting to think there's something fundamentally broken about me." I spent 45 minutes with her in the conference center cafe, sharing strategies for beginning to reach out to others, helping her identify activities and communities where she might meet like-minded people, and most importantly, normalizing her experience as something that could be addressed rather than endured. "The most important thing to remember," I told her as we prepared to part ways, "is that learning to connect with others is like learning any other skill. You're going to be awkward at first, you're going to make mistakes, but if you keep practicing and remain open to feedback, you'll gradually get better at it." 6 months later, I received an email from that same programmer. She'd joined a hiking group, started taking improv classes, and was dating someone she'd met through a book club. She was still working on developing deeper friendships, but she no longer felt hopeless about her social life. "The biggest change," she wrote, "wasn't learning specific techniques for making friends. It was realizing that my loneliness was a problem I could solve rather than a permanent character trait I had to accept." Stories like hers reinforced my belief that David and I had stumbled onto something important in our friendship experiment. We discovered that the artificial structure of a paid relationship could create a safe space for learning the skills and developing the confidence needed for authentic connection. More importantly, we'd proven that it's never too late to learn how to be truly intimate with another human being. As I write this, it's been 5 years since I first paid David to be my friend. The foundation now operates in 12 cities across the United States, serving over 500 clients annually. David's research on artificial social interactions and their effects on genuine connection has been published in major journals and cited by other researchers around the world. My relationship with Sarah has deepened into the kind of partnership I never thought possible, built on mutual respect, shared values, and the kind of emotional intimacy I once believed was reserved for other people. But the most significant change isn't in any of these external markers of success. It's in how I move through the world on a daily basis. I no longer feel like I'm performing the role of a social being while secretly believing I'm fundamentally disconnected from others. I no longer use money as a substitute for emotional availability or genuine interest in other people's lives. I no longer assume that my loneliness is evidence of some unfixable flaw in my character. Instead, I wake up each morning knowing that I have people in my life who care about me not because of what I can do for them, but because of who I am when all the achievements and acquisitions are stripped away. I have learned to be someone worth caring about. Not because I'm perfect or always easy to be around, but because I'm willing to show up authentically in relationships, to be vulnerable when it matters, and to prioritize the well-being of people I love, even when it's inconvenient or costly. The irony is that this transformation began with what appeared to be the most transactional relationship imaginable, literally paying someone to spend time with me. But beneath that artificial structure, David and I discovered something that no amount of money could have purchased, the recognition that we were both worthy of genuine care and capable of providing it to others. I still think about that desperate, lonely man who sat in his penthouse office 5 years ago, convinced that his isolation was permanent and irreversible. I want to tell him that help is available, that connection is possible, that the skills he never learned can still be developed with patience and practice. I want to assure him that his loneliness isn't evidence of weakness or failure, but simply information about what he needs to prioritize in his life. Most of all, I want to tell him that the best investment he'll ever make won't be in stocks or real estate or cryptocurrency. It will be in learning how to love and be loved by other human beings, even if that learning process looks nothing like what he expected, even if it requires admitting ignorance about things that seem to come naturally to everyone else, even if it means paying someone $200,000 to teach him what friendship feels like from the inside. Because in the end, what I paid for wasn't friendship itself. What I paid for was the opportunity to discover that I was capable of friendship all along. I just needed someone patient enough to help me find that capacity within myself and generous enough to stick around while I learned how to use it. David gave me that gift, and now, through the foundation and the documentary and the countless conversations with people struggling with their own loneliness, we're trying to give that same gift to others. Not the gift of purchased companionship, but the gift of knowing that authentic connection is possible for everyone, even those of us who have to learn it the hard way, one awkward conversation at a time. The man who paid $200,000 for a friend ended up discovering something priceless, that he had been worthy of genuine love all along. He just needed to learn how to accept it, and more importantly, how to give it in return. In the process of buying friendship, he learned how to be a friend. In learning how to be a friend, he learned how to be human in the deepest and most meaningful sense of the word. And that perhaps is the most valuable return on investment anyone could ask for.